Hey everyone, welcome to the Cardiovascular Physiology lecture for our exercise phys class. We've already covered the anatomy and a little bit of how things work anatomically and the structures involved with the cardiovascular system. Now we're going to shift gears and look at how those structures help our cardiovascular system function. How does it work? Within this lecture, there's going to be some components that don't really cover the whole uh, spectrum of physiology that you need to know for the cardiovascular system, but we will get the basics and the fundamentals. And then in some of our later sections, when we explore how our physiology works with exercise and training adaptations, we'll explore a little further some concepts of physiology there. Okay, so we're going to start off with something that, because of your lab section in this course, you should be familiar with so far, and that is the cardiac cycle. So we have our two components of that, which is systole and diastole. So you would have came across that as systolic and diastolic. And all those relate to systole is the part of the heart phase that contracts and squeezes or pumps blood out of the heart to the rest of the body. And diastole is when the heart essentially relaxes and blood refills the chambers of the heart. Okay, so uh, the way this pumping usually happens in the body is there's two control methods. So the one is intrinsic, so that means like within the heart itself, or the heart itself has a capacity to regulate and control its own beating. And there are also extrinsic controls, which we'll get to in a moment, okay? But first we'll explore the intrinsic control, and what that brings up for discussion is our topic of autorhythmicity. Okay, so this auto being self and rhythmicity being rhythmic. So it's the heart's capacity to be able to rhythmically contract. Okay, and so what it'll do is again initiate its own electrical or nerve impulse to have a coordinated contraction throughout the heart. That's really the most important part about autorhythmicity, is the fact that it can help coordinate when and where in a heart cycle the heart is contracting. Okay, we're going to talk about 3 points here, 3 nerves and 3 conduction pathways, and then it actually helps to look at a diagram, so we'll skip to that fairly quickly. But we have something called the sinoatrial, and I might say SA node. It's just shorthand for that. So the sinoatrial node, if you can think of it already with your knowledge of heart anatomy and think atrium, okay, atrial, that sounds very similar because it is. Then we're going to be starting near the top of the heart with that. And that node is really considered the pacemaker for the whole contraction. So it kind of initiates when we have atrial and contraction. So our systolic component of our contraction of our heart. We'll see that those nerves kind of innervate and lead to our atrioventricular node, which again, you might be able to tell by the name. It goes from the atria through to our ventricles. So again, the smaller top chambers to the lower, larger chambers. And you'll see there's a physical space between the two nerve systems to allow a little bit of a break, right? So that we get that lub-dub, lub-dub. So you hear kind of 2 separate beats rather than a la-duh when we get a heart rate, right? So with our heartbeats, there's a little bit of delay just to allow blood to fully enter the ventricular chambers and have our valves shut before ventricular contraction occurs. And then from the AV node, we see we'll see that the end of the line as far as this nerve impulse in the heart is at the Purkinje fibers, and they help spread out this impulse or this signal to contract around the whole heart. Okay, let's take a little look at that. enough foreshadowing and background information, right? Let's dive into it and see some pictures. So as we see here, as promised, we have our SA node here, starts the signal. We'll just follow one pathway, but again, it goes throughout the entire nerve from this base part, so it'll spread out down in those pathways. So our one nerve conduction brings us to the AV node, which is right there, or atrioventricular, and you can see it sits between the two. From there, our signal's carried throughout the AV bundle, which is a bundle of nerves that lead down into the right and the left, or I guess depending on whose heart you're talking about, whether it's your own or one that you're looking at, right and the left bundle branches, which then turn into the Purkinje fibers. Okay, and you can see they're quite spread out and diverse at that point in time, or disperse, not diverse, sorry. Okay, and so that's the signal, and again, there's some physical space here to allow for that 1/10 of a second delay between atrial contraction and ventricular contraction. And functionally, something to keep in mind about the valves here is, so these are your AV valves, right, between your atrium and your ventricle. So what will happen with all valves in your heart, but just using this as an example, is they're a one-way gate. Okay, so here in the diagram it shows it's open, so blood flows through from the atria to the ventricle, so it pops open. But as soon as there's some contraction within the ventricle, so some backflow, if you will, a little bit of blood this way, the valves immediately have that pressure push against them and they snap shut. So if the gate's only ever working in one direction, when you go to push back, it shuts the valve, okay? My best example of this would be like if you're at a store, maybe like a Walmart or Target or something like that, and they have the carousels at gates as you enter that only go one way, right? You try to walk in, you try to go back, maybe you forgot something, you can't go back because the gate stops. It's a very similar idea. Okay, so these are intrinsic controls or methods of developing autorhythmicity in the heart, but we also, as I mentioned before, have extrinsic control, and that comes from two segments or systems of our nervous system. We haven't covered those quite yet, so the gist of it before we dive into detail in the nervous system chapter would be our parasympathetic system is involved in rest and digestion. So you can think about slow heart rates, activities that don't demand a lot of energy, or I guess you can think of it that way, and something associated with high parasympathetic drive, or usually it's more associated with high levels of training or maybe a pathology, so like a medical condition. But usually when you have very highly trained elite endurance athletes, what you'll find is they have bradycardic, or slow, brady being slow, cardia being heart, so have a slow heart rate. As you might remember from lab, an average heart rate, resting heart rate is about 60. If you went through your activities and actually measured it, if someone was truly rested, like laying down almost asleep for about 5 to 10 minutes, you'll note that people's heart rates actually can get much lower than that. And sure enough, with elite trained athletes, some get their resting heart rates into the 40s. Semi-regularly, 50 is a pretty common for like a fairly well-trained individual who participates in endurance activity quite a bit. And just side note to that's actually a really good thing, because it goes to show how efficient the heart is. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to cardiac output. Okay, so parasympathetic nervous system, rest and digest, slow heart rate, decreases the heart rate. And then the other nervous system that can kick in or take over for us when we need is our sympathetic nervous system. So you might have heard of fight or flight. This is the nervous system that is involved in that. And we want that nervous system to kick in when, we need to avoid physical danger is one example, but just be able to become more alert and more ready for physical activity. And so that will increase our heart rate. Okay. So fight or flight, rest or digest, we got a decrease or increase of our heart rates, again, depending on what sort of extrinsic control or stimuli we're receiving. Okay. The last influence would be endocrine glands. And again, just to cover this for the depth that we need to know now, you can think of a situation where we have sympathetic nerve activation, or our sympathetic nervous system attenuates our alertness, gets our heart rate going. A lot of us associate that with increased adrenaline, right? We think of that. And so sure enough, that's part of the hormones. So endocrine glands produce hormones in our bodies. And again, one of the main things that will increase our heart rate from the adrenal glands is epinephrine. Okay, so just, I don't know if the schematic helps very much with these concepts, but just to kind of landmark a general location when I'm talking about parasympathetic and sympathetic nerves. Generally, it's within our nervous system, but it's more, and for now, it's just useful to know that they kind of originate midbrain, and some of our higher brain functions can cue them up, so we can cognitively think of exercise and our heart rate actually starts increasing, whether you know it or not. Like if you were to sit here, look at your resting heart rate, thinking about forest meadows and streams or whatever, something really relaxing, and then you're to think about exercising as hard as you can, doing 100-meter sprints over and over and over, and look at your heart rate again, you'll notice that it's elevated. And that's just a mental cue that cues up our sympathetic nervous system to increase our heart rate. As far as our parasympathetic nervous system, one really important nerve, there's lots here, but the really important one is the vagus nerve. And that essentially keeps a bit of a control over our heart rate and to keep it quite regular. We'll cover that a bit more later. Okay. So we got intrinsic control, extrinsic control, and so far, if you haven't noticed, for the majority of this, it's been nervous. There's been a little bit that's been hormonal, but let's actually look at the muscle cells themselves. So cardiac muscle, or myo being muscle, and cardium being our heart. And I spoke about in the last lecture how there was these leaky connections between the cardiac muscle cells of the heart and the intercalated discs. So again, it was kind of like a filter with a bunch of holes in it. The reason they're really important, this is what the point I'm trying to get to, is that it allows some leakiness between the two cells, and with that it allows the impulse, this nervous impulse, to kind of travel more easily between cells. And that's really good because we want something called syncytial contraction, which just means synchronized or simultaneous contraction of these heart muscles, right? If you can kind of picture in your head what might happen if some of the muscle fibers are firing at very different times, we wouldn't be able to get as timely or coordinated of a contraction with our heartbeats, right? They might be a little slower. Potentially we could have different parts of the heart firing at different times. And so again, if you think about how the valves work, maybe we'll have multiple valves closing versus being open and allowing blood to flow in. And so it's a really, really good thing that help with our autorhythmicity, that we have these leaky connections between cardiac myocardial cells and this synchronized contraction. Okay. So this should probably be lined up back here. It's kind of its own point. So far, a lot of what I've been explaining sounds a lot like skeletal muscle that we've covered. So, for example, we get a neural signal, and there's this neuromuscular junction, and it causes muscle cells to contract, and all of that is similar between skeletal and myocardiac cells. But there's some differences, major differences between skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle, and they are of particular interest would be in our cardiac cells or myocardium versus skeletal muscle. We have higher mitochondrial density, and if we think of that, that's a really great thing, right? So if you recall, what do mitochondria house? What do they do? What's important about it? Well, that's where we have all our oxidative respiration or our aerobic metabolism, right? So that's where we get lots of very efficient and high levels of ATP produced, right? So we're talking about Krebs and ETC, right? Okay, so again, if we can imagine, do we want our hearts to have a lot of available energy at its disposal? Absolutely. Why? What happens when your heart stops beating? You have a very short amount of time to get CPR and hopefully continue living after by getting your heart started again, right? So really, really important as far as the structure and for its function for myocardia. Similarly, I guess this is the same point. So it uses aerobic energy for contracting. But I think the other point to make clear here that's special about myocardium versus skeletal muscle is it has a very, very extensive capillary network. And as you recall from last lecture, capillaries are these single cell vessels, blood vessels that allow lots of oxygen to be delivered. So again, primo setup for oxidative respiration. Okay. Yeah, and I guess the other part that kind of ties into all of that is there is only one type of muscle fiber for myocardium. Again, if you recall back to skeletal muscle, there's more than one. If you have two broad types plus some intermediate fibers. Okay, great. Now, along the lines of the myocardium, we notice that our the wall thickness of a heart is kind of it looks pretty beefy in some parts, for lack of descriptive word. Like if you look at, in particular, the ventricles, is fairly thick walls there, right? So why is that? Again, structure is function, and we're talking about physiology and how the heart functions. So if we have a larger cross-sectional area muscle, and this includes skeletal muscle in this point, but of cardiac muscle, we can produce a greater force, okay? And that's really important when we're talking about the ventricles, and in particular, the left ventricle. Okay, let's pause and think why that might be the case, okay? So here you have four chambers of your heart, the atrium, two ventricles, and what happens, right? Well, our atria contract, but they only need to pump blood to the next chamber over, right? It's a very short distance. And so would they need a lot of force to be able to do that? No, not necessarily, okay? Your right ventricle, and again, the ventricles contract at the same time, but looking just at the right ventricle for a second, when that contracts, that goes to your pulmonary circulatory system. So that's your lungs. Again, the lungs are relatively close by, and and there's a lot of capillaries in and around the lungs as well. So very thin vessels. Okay, so shorter distance, not as let's say robust vascular system per se, in the sense that it's there's not as thick arterial walls for a long duration of travel time. So again, do we need a very strong force for that? No, we need definitely some more than we would from the atria to the ventricles, but maybe not as much as our left ventricle, okay? And so let's think for a moment where the blood goes from the left ventricle. Your entire body, right? It goes to your coronary arteries. It goes to your hands, your feet, your head. It's got to go up against gravity about this far, right? That's significant. So, so what we find through some pathologies, so like hypertension, so high blood pressure. So if you have chronically high blood pressure, or interestingly enough, if you're really well trained, we tend to see a large enlarging or thickening or increase in ventricular mass or muscle, again, just on the left side in particular. Both ventricles, when you get really well trained, tend to have a bit of that thickening, but it is primarily the left. Now that might sound a little worrying and a little concerning that if you exercise, you get an enlarged heart or a larger heart. But ultimately, if you do it through training, say like endurance training, maybe some weightlifting, but what will tend to happen is it grows proportionate to your body size and your body's demands. When it becomes pathological or becomes a medical issue, in other words, that typically has to do with underlying hypertension or pathology, that again the heart gets too thick of a ventricular wall. Okay, but usually it just increases to about the relative size of whatever that individual needs based off of the training they've been doing. Okay, all right. Great. So one of the things that we can chat about next is going to be something called ECG, or electrocardiograms. You've probably heard of them before. You've seen them on TV and different medical shows. But why are we looking at this in the case of heart physiology? Well, it's a way we can actually measure and view what is occurring in the heart with external electrodes, right? So maybe I'll just flash forward a bit. Again, this is an ECG, so that's what it looks like, right? Probably have seen these. Again, it's on the monitor in medical shows, always closely watched and monitored. But what is it actually looking at? What is it measuring? Well, it's measuring the movement of ions during muscle contraction and relaxation. But one of the ways you can kind of think of it is somewhat related to how the heart contracts, okay? But we'll look at that in a second. So electrical activity coincides with contraction and relaxation of the chambers, and we'll look at that on the ECG. It's reading ECGs, I should make as a side note, is really like an art and a science. So people that get their specialties in cardiology or like very advanced paramedic training, it can tell you a lot, but almost so much that it's challenging to interpret sometimes. So the people that do this and do this well are, they definitely have a very special skill. But we'll go over what these usually represent in normal individuals and roughly what they look like. And then we'll go over some conditions or pathology type readings, just a couple of vague and kind of broad ones. Obviously, like if you ever see your a friend's or family member's ECG, based off of this, you can probably read some things and understand it. I wouldn't necessarily, you could diagnose everything in all that's occurring in the heart, right? So, okay, I digress. Here we are. So what are we actually looking at when we see an ECG as far as the two axes in this graph? Well, the up and down axis, or the vertical axis or y-axis, looks at the amount, I guess, of electrical activity, or the amount of movement of ions that we see for any given moment. And the bottom, or the x-axis, the horizontal one, is time. So for any moment in time, we can see. So if something stretches out longer, wider, that means that it's got a longer period of time. Anything that's higher means there's a greater movement of ions, okay? Which, again, for a lot of context of what we'll be looking at, you can associate with some sort of contraction, okay? But let's look specifically at that. So as you can see, we have a P wave, and it goes just from P to T. So P, Q, R, S, T, okay? So here's the P wave, and the P wave is associated with atrial depolarization. So if you remember, that's the top chambers of the heart. Depolarization means contraction. So you have that contraction, and that kicks off our systolic component of our heart cardiac cycle. And then you'll notice that there's this kind of flat line here. So the PQ segment, so from P to Q, is that little bit of pause before the ventricles fire. And here we are, all the action. We have our Q, our S complex or interval, and that's when we get ventricular depolarization. So that's when the ventricles fire. You can think it's just the size and the amount of electrical activity it takes to recruit all of that muscle mass for the ventricles, both the left and the right, is a lot, right? So we see a really big peak for that. Again, a little bit of a delay as we're kind of getting back to baseline, and the ventricular repolarization, or this whole segment here, is when we get diastole. So the heart is refilling, okay? All right, so that's how we'd look at a standard, healthy, typical looking ECG. What can happen, yeah, you can always refer to that slide afterwards, but it was just what we spoke about. So what if we use this in a diagnostic test, because that's absolutely what they're used for in a clinical setting? Well, if we see something called an ST depression, what that can indicate is myocardial ischemia. So heart muscle death, essentially due to lack of oxygen, okay? And so the tissues, you can get ischemic occurrences happening all throughout the body if any blood flow gets blocked. So I was mentioning before in the previous lecture something about emboli and things blocking. So the emboli is the thing that like blocks a certain blood vessel. Ischemia is what happens to the tissues after that blockage, or behind or down blood flow from that blockage. Okay, so you can get it in a lot of different places. If it happens in the heart, that's when we get myocardial ischemia. Okay. Yeah, and so that's a ST segment depression. We'll take a look at that in a moment. And then an increase or decrease in our PR segment indicates AV node malfunctioning of some sort. So again, if you remember, we have our SA node, which is our pacemaker, and then our AV is the secondary one that follows that, okay? So let's take a look at what that might look like. Yeah, so here we have our ST segment depression. So that would be the myocardiac ischemia, or myocardial ischemia. And so what happens, again, if we think about what's going on at this point, this is the repolarization. And so if there's some sort of muscle cell trauma occurring, it's just that flow of ions isn't quite as much. So again, we see this kind of upflow after muscular contraction, or ventricular contraction. And then if we look at our, now you might notice like elevated R, but we're talking about the P to R segment. And if this gets longer, if you remember what the P wave is, that's the SA node firing. And so before we get our AV and ventricular contraction going, there's a longer delay here. I don't feel it represented it very well. But if you get an AV, or a longer time horizontally, so we're not talking about vertical changes in the ECG, we're talking about horizontal changes, that's when you can see some AV node functioning, either just functioning abnormally. Okay, so that is it for now with our cardiovascular physiology just in general. We'll start getting into something that's really important that helps further explain the physiology occurring with our heart and our vascular system combined, called cardiac output. And we'll also look into how exercising and training effects change our physiology.